The fog came in off the Thames that November evening like a slow closing of a fist, pressing down on the Ashworth Ballroom's tall windows until the glass wept with condensation, and the assembled guests within seemed to float in their own amber warmth, entirely sealed from the world outside. Every chandelier had been lit. Every candle in the side sconces burned without a flicker, protected from drafts by footmen who stood at each door with the blank concentration of men paid to think about nothing. The Viscount Ashworth had spent £400 on flowers alone, hothouse roses in cream and blush, arranged in silver urns that stood at measured intervals along the gallery wall, and the smell of them by 9 o'clock had grown heavy enough to press against the back of the throat like velvet. And at the far edge of all that arranged magnificence, seated at a small writing table behind the third pillar from the door, checking the seating list against the printed cards she had revised twice that afternoon, was Miss Harriet Fulwell. She wore grey, not the fashionable grey of the season, which ran to silver and pewter and was meant to suggest expensive restraint, but ordinary grey, the grey of a gown altered twice from a previous cut, the hem let down, and the sleeves extended with a strip of matching fabric that almost matched. She had done the work herself, late, by a candle that kept guttering. The gown was not remarkable, which was, in a sense, the point. Harriet Fulwell had learned some years ago that remarkable gowns attracted the kind of attention that made invisible work impossible to do. She had a list. She always had a list. This one covered the dinner seating for 42 guests, the corrected order of the dessert course, the substitute flower arrangement for the east alcove where the roses had arrived without the greenery that was meant to offset them, and a note about the third footman on the left side of the gallery, who had a developing cold, and should be repositioned so that he was not standing above the soup. She had identified the cold 40 minutes earlier, from the faint tension around his jaw when he suppressed the urge to clear his throat. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Harriet was 28, and she had been keeping rooms standing for 6 years. The double doors at the end of the gallery opened at 9:30, and the room reorganized itself without meaning to, the way rooms always reorganize themselves for a man of a certain kind. Harriet looked up once, noted the arrival, looked back down at her list. She looked up a second time. The Duke of Ravenscar was taller than the doorframe required him to be, which gave him the appearance of a man who moved through spaces built for someone shorter. He wore black, which was not unusual for a man of his rank and age, but he wore it without ornament, no decorative pin in the cravat, no jeweled buttons on the waistcoat, nothing that suggested he had considered his appearance beyond the structural requirements of the occasion. He was perhaps 35. His face, at the distance Harriet observed it, had the contained quality of a dial that had been carefully calibrated not to move. He did not look at the flowers. He did not look at the chandelier. He crossed the room with the deliberate pace of a man completing an obligation, accepted a glass he did not drink from, and spoke briefly to the Viscount and then to no one else. And then, at some point in the following 4 minutes, Harriet registered this with the same mild precision with which she registered everything. The Duke of Ravenscar looked across the room, past the roses and the silver urns, and the arranged guests, and found the woman sitting behind the third pillar with a list in her hand. He did not look away immediately. That was what she noticed, not the look itself. Men of his rank occasionally glanced at the arrangements, glanced at the service, glanced at whatever was peripheral and irregular, but the duration of it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a figure in a document that does not quite match the column it appeared in, not with interest, not with recognition, but with the quiet, considered attention of someone who has just identified something they have not yet accounted for. Harriet looked back down at her list. The third footman, she noted, had suppressed a second near cough. She flagged the note and returned to her work. She had managed this household social calendar for 4 years without once being introduced to a guest of rank. She did not expect tonight to be different. She picked up her pen, crossed off 2 items that were complete, and went on. 6 years earlier, Harriet Fulwell had arrived at her cousin's house in Mayfair with a small trunk, £17 that remained of her father's estate after the creditors had taken the rest, and the understanding, delivered by her cousin's solicitor in language that was almost kind, that she might stay as long as she was useful. Her father had been a man of modest scholarship and immoderate optimism. He had believed, throughout a career that was largely distinguished by its indirection, that the right introduction would unlock the right opportunity, and that the right opportunity would eventually translate into the financial security he had never quite assembled in direct terms. He had loved books more than ledgers, which was a quality Harriet admired in him as a man, and mourned professionally as his heir. When he died, in the autumn of Harriet's 22nd year, he left behind a rented house in Kensington, a library that had to be sold in portions to cover the immediate debts, and a daughter who had been educated well enough to understand exactly how precarious her situation was. She had learned the accounts from his solicitor, a patient man named Mr. Aldous Greer, who had been honest with her when honesty would have been more comfortably left to euphemism. "Your father owed more than remained," he had told her, sitting across a desk covered in papers that looked, to Harriet, like the physical evidence of all the choices she had not been consulted about. "But you are organized, Miss Folwell," which he was not, "and there is a situation with your cousin's household that might suit you while you determine what comes next." What came next was 6 years with her cousin, Mrs. Edith Clarendon, who managed the social obligations of a husband who was absent 8 months of the year on matters of trade. Mrs. Clarendon was not unkind. She was simply not observant. She accepted whatever Harriet arranged without registering that it had been arranged, the way a person accepts a well-built bridge without thinking about the engineering beneath the road. In the first year, Harriet organized the household accounts, which had not been properly maintained since the previous housekeeper retired, and identified 2 recurring discrepancies, one in the coal delivery records and one in the weekly grocery invoices, that together represented £31 annually in quiet misdirection. She corrected them without making a scene. The coal merchant and the grocer were simply presented with revised contracts that made the error structurally impossible to repeat. Neither man tested the revision. In the second year, she renegotiated the household's arrangement with the linen supplier, reducing the monthly figure by 4 shillings per delivery without reducing the quality of the goods, because she had taken the time to compare 4 supplier proposals and understood which margins were real and which were decorative. In the third year, her cousin's husband returned from Bristol with a debt that threatened to close the house entirely, a co-signing arrangement he had entered without reading the full clause. Harriet spent 3 evenings with the relevant documents, a lamp, and the index of contract law her father's solicitor had left her when he retired, and found a clause in the original agreement that limited the liability to the first signatory's personal assets, not the household accounts. She wrote a letter on her cousin's behalf, careful, precise, citing the clause number and the relevant precedent, and the matter resolved within a fortnight. No one thanked her. Mrs. Clarendon believed the matter had resolved itself, which was perhaps the kind of thing that happened when one had the right sort of connections. Harriet put the index back on the shelf and noted the resolution in her private accounts book with the date and the relevant clause number, because she intended to remember what she had done, even if no one else would. There had been one moment, in the second winter, when she might have broken. The situation was not dramatic. That was almost the worst of it. A distant relation had written to suggest that Harriet might consider a position as a companion in the north of England, a family she did not know, a county she had never visited, wages that were described as adequate, which Harriet understood to mean approximately nothing. The letter had been forwarded through Mrs. Clarendon, who had left it on the morning room table without comment, which was itself a comment. Harriet sat with the letter for approximately 20 minutes. She looked at the morning room, the curtains she had chosen, the arrangement of the writing desk she had reorganized for better light, the accounts ledger open to the current week's reconciliation. She thought about what the North would mean, beginning again from nothing, in a household that would take another 6 years to understand, for adequate wages that would never compound into anything worth having. She was not going to step aside for that. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer with the rest of the correspondence that did not require a response, and returned to the accounts. She had 32 tenant ledger entries to check before Thursday, and the wine merchant's annual invoice had arrived with 2 figures transposed, which she had not yet corrected. She was going to survive this. She had already decided. She did not know that a man had recently hired an investigator to document, in specific and unadorned detail, exactly what she had survived. The Duke of Ravenscar, James Aldrich Pemberton, 8th holder of the title, proprietor of an estate in Suffolk that ran to 14,000 acres and had not been properly administered since his father's declining years, had been presented with 17 names over the preceding 8 weeks. The list had come from his solicitor, a composed man named Mr. Edward Calder, who had been with the family for 11 years and who understood that the Duke's requirements were not conventional. The Duke did not need a woman of exceptional beauty, or fashionable accomplishment, or strategic family connection. He needed a woman who could manage an estate whose accounts had been in quiet disorder for the better part of a decade, whose household had never fully recovered from the loss of his mother 12 years ago, and who would not be undone by the particular quality of isolation that Ravenscar imposed on anyone who lived there without preparation. He had reviewed 15 of the 17 names with the attention of a man reading contracts, which was, in fact, exactly what he was doing, since each name came with a brief summary of the woman's household, circumstances, and observable qualities. 15 names had been set aside, for reasons that ranged from the practical to the structural. The 16th had seemed briefly promising, and then revealed, upon a second reading, that the reputation for household management came from a housekeeper the woman had never actually met. The 17th name was Miss Harriet Folwell, of Mayfair. The summary had been 3 pages. Calder had presented it with the particular neutral expression he used when he believed the Duke would find the information significant. The Duke had read all 3 pages without setting them down, which was itself a measure. He had then asked Calder to obtain the supplementary documentation, the household accounts for the past 4 years, and had read those too. What he found in the accounts was not sentimentality, and it was not, precisely, admiration. It was recognition. The figures had been maintained with a consistency and clarity that he had encountered in perhaps 3 other sets of accounts in his professional life, and 2 of those had been prepared by trained solicitors. Miss Folwell's reconciliations were cross-referenced. Her corrections were annotated with the date, the source of the discrepancy, and the method of resolution. She had written in a hand that was small and precise and, in the margins, occasionally acerbic in a way that suggested she was writing for herself and not for an audience, which he found more informative than anything in the formal summary. One margin note read, "The greengrocer has now provided 3 invoices with the quantity of spring onions listed in a different unit each time. I have standardized. He will not try this again." He read that sentence twice. His mother had kept accounts like this. Before her illness, before the long decline that had taken 12 years and then taken her entirely, she had been the person who made Ravenscar work, not because she was required to by the machinery of her position, but because she understood what work was, and what it meant to do it correctly. He had been a boy of 23 when she died. He had understood, at some point in the years since, that what he was looking for in a wife was someone who would not be diminished by what Ravenscar was, and what it required, and what it had cost every person who had tried to manage it without sufficient preparation. He attended the Ashworth gathering because Calder had told him Miss Folwell would be there, not as a guest, but in her usual capacity, managing the arrangements. He went in order to look, not to decide, not to approach, simply to observe whether the woman in the accounts was also the woman in the room. She was behind the 3rd pillar, he noted. She had a list, which did not surprise him. She wore gray, which told him something about how she understood her position in that room, and something about the resources she had available for her appearance, and something about the fact that she was not attempting to be noticed, all 3 of which he filed in the column of information that was becoming, without his formal decision, relevant. She looked up at him once, noted him in the same efficient way she had been noting the footman, and looked back at her list. He stood in the Ashworth's gallery for another 40 minutes. He spoke to the host, declined 3 introductions to women of more evident eligibility, and refused a second glass he had not wanted the first of. Before he left, he collected his coat from the footman near the door, a young man whose jaw, the Duke observed, had the careful tension of someone suppressing a persistent throat clearing, and walked out into the fog. He had already decided. 3 days after the Ashworth gathering, Harriet received a formal letter of introduction through Mrs. Clarendon's solicitor. The Duke of Ravenscar's household was seeking a person of demonstrated competence to serve in a consultative capacity regarding the organization and administration of Ravenscar estate, with a view to a permanent arrangement to be discussed upon satisfactory introduction. The language was careful and deliberate, and unlike anything Harriet had seen produced for such a purpose, because it used words like demonstrated, and consultative, and discussed, which were not the usual vocabulary of such proposals. Mrs. Clarendon read the letter twice and looked at Harriet with an expression that was approximately 1 part surprise, 1 part reassessment, and 4 parts the dawning understanding that something had been happening in her household for 6 years that she had not been tracking. Mr. Calder arrived on Thursday to conduct the formal introduction. He was a composed man of perhaps 55, who had the careful manner of someone who had spent decades in the company of principals who paid for discretion. He sat in the morning room, accepted tea he barely touched, and asked Harriet 4 questions. The first was about the coal discrepancy she had corrected in her first year. He had the figure to the pound. The second was about the contract clause she had used to resolve her cousin's debt. The third was about the annotated margins in the accounts ledger, which he quoted precisely, including the note about the greengrocer and the spring onions. Harriet sat with her hands folded in her lap and answered each question with the same straightforward economy she used to answer every practical question, because these were, in fact, practical questions, and she had good answers to them. The fourth question was whether she would agree to visit Ravenscar in Suffolk for a period of 3 weeks, to assess the estate's organizational requirements and to meet the Duke formally. She considered this for a measured moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she had been deciding things correctly for 6 years, by thinking about them completely before she answered. Yes, she said, I would need 1 week to arrange for the handover of the current household management to a suitable deputy. Calder made a note. 1 week is entirely agreeable. She spent the week writing the most organized transition document Mrs. Clarendon had ever received, which she could not read because it assumed familiarity with the accounts, and arranging for Edith, the senior housemaid, to take on the daily administration with a set of clear written instructions divided by day of the week. On the 8th day, she packed her small trunk, put her accounts ledger in the top of it, and went to Suffolk. Ravenscar in November looked the way an argument sounds when it has been going on for too long: large, cold, insistent, and impossible to simply walk away from. The house was Jacobean at its core, with additions from 2 subsequent centuries that had been assembled with more ambition than coherence. It sat at the top of a long drive flanked by oaks that had shed their leaves and stood now like iron brackets against a gray sky. Harriet took all of this in from the carriage window with the attentiveness she applied to everything, noted the condition of the drive, serviceable but the gravel edge was beginning to erode on the left side, and stepped down when the door was opened. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Agnes Bowman, who was perhaps 60, with the particular economy of movement that long years of household management produce. She met Harriet at the front steps, with no discernible expression that could be called either welcome or resistance, simply an honest assessment, the way a carpenter looks at a proposed repair. Within 20 minutes, Harriet understood that Mrs. Bowman had been managing the house largely alone for 11 years, that she was competent in the parts of the work that were familiar to her, and that she had been quietly overwhelmed by the financial administration since the previous estate manager had retired without a replacement being hired. I am glad, Mrs. Bowman said, in a tone that conveyed this with no ceremony at all, that someone is coming who can read a ledger. I have been told, Harriet said, that the estate accounts may require attention. They may require excavation, said Mrs. Bowman, without changing her expression, and Harriet felt something that was not quite ease, but was closer to it than she had expected. The Duke met her formally at dinner on the first evening. He sat at one end of a table that had been built for 20, and she sat at the other end, which was the kind of architectural comedy that very old houses occasionally produced, and said almost nothing for the first 2 courses. This did not trouble Harriet, who had spent 6 years in rooms where people spoke a great deal about very little, and found the silence more usefully occupied with observing the dining room's service arrangements, which required some reorganization. It was over the 3rd course that he spoke directly to her for the first time. Mr. Calder tells me, the Duke said, that you identified a contract liability limitation without a solicitor's assistance. With a solicitor's index, Harriet said. I would not wish to overstate the case. The distinction is noted. Which clause did you cite? She told him. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had observed across the Ashworth ballroom. Not warmer than that, not more social, but entirely present. That is the correct clause, he said. Yes, she said. It was. He almost smiled. It was a very small movement, and if she had not been in the habit of watching rooms carefully, she would have missed it entirely. She spent the first 4 days at Ravenscar in the estate office, with the accounts ledgers, a pot of tea that Mrs. Bowman sent without being asked, and a growing sense that what the estate needed was not repairs so much as reconstruction. The records had been maintained with declining attention for approximately 7 years and had arrived, in the most recent 18 months, at a state that was not quite chaos, but was chaos's reliable precursor. There were 3 tenant farm agreements that had not been reviewed in 11 years. There was a standing arrangement with a wool merchant in Ipswich that had been paying the estate a fixed quarterly figure that, Harriet calculated by Thursday afternoon, was approximately £40 per quarter below the current fair market rate for the volume of wool the Ravenscar flocks produced. She put this calculation in a separate column, checked it twice, and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a number that does not lie. On the 5th day, the opposition arrived from London. Lady Cecily Wren was 24 and had been, by the understanding of the particular social circle that concerned itself with such things, the most likely next Duchess of Ravenscar for the better part of 2 years. She was beautiful in the way that certain rooms are beautiful, everything in exactly its arranged place, everything chosen with care, nothing present that did not contribute to the intended effect. She arrived with her mother, a sharp-faced woman who wore her certainty like a second coat, and a maid who had the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned early that her employer preferred to appear self-sufficient. They arrived on the pretense of a social call. Lady Cecily's family had a connection to the estate that predated the current Duke's tenure, and were shown to the drawing room before Harriet had a chance to register their arrival. She learned of it from Agnes, the young maid who had been assigned to assist her during the visit. Agnes was 19, and had a directness of manner that Harriet found more useful than tact. Lady Cecily's arrived, she said, appearing in the doorway of the estate office, with the expression of someone delivering weather news. With her mother, in the blue drawing room, His Grace has been informed. Thank you, Agnes, Harriet said, and returned to the quarterly calculation she was completing. At the luncheon that followed, arranged by Mrs. Bowman, with the speed and precision of someone who had done this before, Harriet was placed, by the unspoken mathematics of social rank, at the far end of the table. Lady Cecily sat 2 positions from the Duke, and managed the luncheon with the competent ease of a woman who had been practicing exactly this performance for years. She was, Harriet noted without rancor, genuinely accomplished at it. The conversation was well managed, the references were appropriately calibrated to the Duke's apparent interests, and the whole thing had the quality of a very polished mechanism, doing exactly what it had been built to do. Lady Cecily looked at Harriet once, near the end of the first course, with the particular expression of someone deciding whether a piece of furniture requires acknowledgement. "And you are staying at the house?" she said, in a tone that treated the question as merely geographic. "For 3 weeks, Harriet said. I am assisting with the estate administration." "How useful," Lady Cecily said, and returned her attention to the Duke, which was, Harriet understood, precisely the point of the remark. Harriet put down her fork with a placement that was slightly more deliberate than the occasion required, looked at Lady Cecily with complete composure, and said, "The estate's wool arrangement alone, once renegotiated, will recover approximately £160 annually. I expect to have the full accounting completed by Thursday." She paused one beat. "I mention it because the figure is material to the estate's long-term administration, which is what I understand you to be interested in." The table was quiet for a moment. Lady Cecily's mother adjusted her sleeve. The Duke, at his end of the table, said nothing, and did not look at either of them, but something in the quality of his stillness had changed. like a building that has absorbed a small shock and is deciding whether it requires repair. "Indeed," said Lady Cecily, and smiled with her full professional skill. "How thorough." Harriet returned to her meal. She did not pick up her fork dramatically or set down her glass with emphasis. She simply continued, because she had 14 more items on her estate assessment that required the afternoon's attention, and she was not going to give Lady Cecily's dismissal any more of her energy than she had already allotted. She had managed creditors for 6 years. She could manage this. The private scenes between them were nothing she had anticipated. That was the part that stayed with her. Not their drama, because they had none, but their texture. The Duke moved through his own house like a man in long familiar conversation with its rooms, most of which had not been properly used in years. He knew where the cold drafts came in. He knew which stair creaked on the left side. He knew, she observed, exactly which windows looked toward the east side of the park and would catch the gray afternoon light at 3:30, which was when she had taken to working through the secondary accounts at the desk in the library, because the light was better there. He came to the library on the third evening at 9:30, after the rest of the house was settled. She was still at the desk, working through the tenant farm figures, and she heard the door and looked up, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, as though giving her the option of the space remaining entirely hers. "I did not mean to disturb the work," he said. "The work can wait," she said, which was not true, but was the sort of courtesy she rarely offered, and she was aware of offering it specifically to him. He sat in the chair across from her desk, not the chair near the fire, which would have been more comfortable, but the chair across from her desk, which was the useful placement, and looked at the open ledger. "Have you found the secondary discrepancy?" he said. She looked at him. "In the tenant farm agreements?" "There are 2, he said. "I identified one 4 years ago, and could not find the other. I lacked the methodology." She turned the ledger to face him, and pointed to the line. "The notation is deliberate," she said. "Whoever made the original entry knew it was wrong, and phrased it to be difficult to compare against the preceding year, without a calculation that takes approximately 20 minutes. Most people reviewing the accounts would accept the line and move to the next. But you did the calculation." "I do all the calculations," she said. "That is what the work requires." He looked at the ledger for a long moment, and then at her, with an expression she could not categorize. Not warmth exactly, not admiration in the ordinary sense, but something that had the quality of recognition, like a lock and a key that have been separately unremarkable, and are only now, in proximity, becoming what they were designed to be. "My mother kept accounts," he said. "It was stated without preamble or apparent agenda. I read them after she died. They were the most organized documents in the house." Harriet set her pen down. "How long ago?" 12 years. She was unwell for a long time before. He said this the way he said most things, without decoration, without angling for a response. The estate suffered for it, not because she was essential to its survival, but because she was the only person who had ever looked at it completely. "That is a particular kind of loss," Harriet said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She picked up her pen and turned the ledger back to face her. He did not leave. He stayed in the chair across from the desk and read. He had brought a volume from the far shelf, she had not registered when, and they remained in the library together for another 2 hours, which was the longest Harriet had been in a room with another person, without either speaking or being expected to speak, and which she found, in a way she did not examine in detail, more restful than anything she had experienced in a very long time. On the 9th day of her visit, she went to correct the cravat. This was not a plan. She had encountered him in the morning room before breakfast, and the cravat was crooked. Not disastrously, not visibly from the other side of the room, but crooked in a way that would read poorly at the meeting they were both about to attend. A working session with Calder and the estate's land agent about the tenant farm renegotiations. She had been looking at the cravat for approximately 6 minutes while they waited for Calder to arrive, and at some point, the 6 minutes became 7, and she decided that the situation was simply inefficient. She crossed the room, said, "It has been crooked for 40 minutes, possibly longer," and straightened it. It took 4 seconds. She stepped back. He stood very still throughout this. When she was done, He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not his usual calibrated containment, but something that had temporarily exceeded it, like weather coming in behind a wall that was not quite built for it. "Thank you," he said. "It will hold better now," she said, and turned to look at the window, because the land agent had arrived at the end of the drive, and she needed a moment to look at something that was not his face. On the 11th evening, she played the piano. She had not intended to. The music room was at the far west end of the house, past a sequence of rooms that were largely unused, and she had passed it twice in her survey of the estate, and noted it, and moved on. On the 11th evening, returning late from the library, she stopped at the door. The room was cold. The piano was a Broadwood grand, perhaps 30 years old, and had been kept covered with a cloth that bore the careful quality of something that had been placed once, and not moved since. She lifted the cloth at one corner, sat on the bench, and opened the fallboard, and felt the keys without pressing them for a moment. She played for perhaps 40 minutes, not performing, not practicing, simply the quiet occupation of music that had been her private resource since childhood, since her father had taught her on a battered upright in their Kensington sitting room, and told her that the piano was the one instrument that was entirely answerable to the person playing it. She played 2 pieces she knew well, and then, in the last quarter of the time, she played something she had found on the music stand, a handwritten composition, 8 pages in a small, careful notation. She did not know it, but she could read music well, and she played through it slowly, following the indicated tempo, which was unhurried and slightly formal in the way of an earlier generation's domestic compositions. She did not know, until the following morning, that the composition had been written by his mother. She did not know, until Agnes told her with her characteristic directness, that the Duke had stood in the corridor outside the music room for the length of her playing and had not moved. She did not ask him about it. She put the cover back on the fallboard, returned the cloth to its place, and went back to her room. She pressed one hand briefly against the corridor wall as she walked. She had been doing real skilled work for 6 years, in rooms where no one watched her do it. The idea that someone had stood outside a door and simply listened while she played, had done nothing but listened, sat somewhere in her chest like a note struck on a string that was still vibrating. She was not going to be careless with that. She picked it up the way she picked up everything, carefully, practically, with full understanding of what it weighed. When Calder arrived on the 14th day, it was not only about the tenant farms. He brought with him a man named Lord Ashworth, the same Viscount at whose house Harriet had been sitting behind the 3rd pillar 6 weeks earlier, and a second man she did not recognize, who was introduced as Mr. Hartwell, and who represented, Calder explained, a consortium of investors who held an interest in one of the estate's outstanding commercial agreements. The meeting was in the estate office. Harriet had laid out the relevant documents 2 hours before it began, organized by agreement date and cross-referenced to the account's ledger entries. She sat to the Duke's right, because Calder had placed her there, which she understood to be a deliberate signal about her function in the meeting. Lord Ashworth looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was calculating whether to acknowledge a woman he had technically seen before in a different capacity, and had decided, after brief consideration, that the capacity at the time had been sufficiently irrelevant that the introduction could be treated as new. He was not malicious, he was simply working with the instruments his world had given him. Hartwell was another matter. He was perhaps 60, with the composed authority of a man who had made money, by understanding that composure was itself a form of pressure. He looked at the documents, looked at Harriet, and said, with no particular unkindness, "I was not aware the estate had a woman assisting with the accounts. Miss Folwell has prepared the account review for this meeting," the Duke said, without inflection. "Evidently," said Hartwell. "I wonder if it might be more efficient to—" "The accounts are accurate," the Duke said. "I have reviewed them. If you have questions about the methodology, Miss Folwell can answer them." Hartwell looked at the Duke for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked at Harriet. "Very well," he said. "The wool merchant arrangement." Harriet opened the relevant section of the ledger. "The current arrangement pays the estate a fixed quarterly figure of £82, she said. "The arrangement was set in 1809, and has not been reviewed." At the current market rate for the volume of wool produced by the Ravenscar flocks, the correct quarterly figure is approximately 123 pounds. The differential, compounded over the 11 years since the arrangement was set, represents a total of approximately 1,800 pounds in underpayment. Hartwell looked at the ledger. That is a significant discrepancy. Yes, Harriet said, it is. I have drafted a revised agreement that reflects the current market rate, with a provision for biennial review going forward. The draft is on the 3rd page. He read it. He read it a second time. Lord Ashworth, beside him, had stopped looking at Harriet, with the peripheral blankness of someone examining furniture, and was now looking at her with the frontal attention of someone who has been required by the evidence to recalibrate. The clause on page 2, said Hartwell. The liability limitation, Harriet said. The previous arrangement left the estate exposed to a particular kind of renegotiation penalty that would have been triggered automatically if the Duke's estate council sought market adjustment. I removed that exposure by citing the equivalent provision in the merchant's own standard terms. He cannot object to his own terms. Hartwell set down the papers. He said nothing for a moment. It was not, Harriet observed, an angry silence or a resistant one. It was the silence of a man who had arrived in a room expecting to conduct a certain kind of meeting and had discovered that the meeting was a different kind entirely. How did you find that provision? He said. I read the merchant's original agreement, Harriet said. All of it. Lord Ashworth's father, the senior Lord Ashworth, who had been sitting with an expression of contained patriarchal skepticism for the full length of the meeting, put down his own copy of the draft agreement and looked at the Duke. Where did you find her? He said. In my own blind spot, the Duke said, which was not the answer Ashworth had been expecting, and which the room absorbed in a long-held moment before anyone spoke again. The public reckoning came on the 16th day, in a form Harriet had not anticipated, because she had been too occupied with the accounts to anticipate anything she was not directly managing. The wool merchant, a compact and privately alarmed man named Josiah Finch, had requested a formal meeting at the estate to contest the revised agreement. He arrived with a solicitor, which Harriet had expected. He arrived with 2 representatives of the Ipswich Merchant Guild, which she had not entirely expected, though she had prepared for the contingency. And he arrived to find that the meeting room already contained, at Lord Ashworth's arrangement, 4 additional witnesses, 2 county magistrates, and 2 of the larger local landowners who had their own wool arrangements and who had been quietly informed, by Calder, that the meeting might be instructive. Harriet stood at the front of the room and presented the figures. She did not argue. She did not plead the Duke's case or her own. She presented the ledger entries in chronological order, the market rate comparisons drawn from the Ipswich Wool Exchange's own published quarterly reports. She had obtained 4 years of these and annotated them, and the provision in Finch's own standard agreement that eliminated his renegotiation penalty exposure. The presentation took approximately 25 minutes. She spoke at the pace of someone who was not worried about time, because the information was organized and the figures were correct, and there was no version of this meeting in which the figures became incorrect simply because someone in the room was uncomfortable. Finch's solicitor raised 3 objections. Harriet answered all 3 with document citations, speaking precisely and without heat, the way she answered every practical question. The 3rd objection, a claim that the market rate comparison was drawn from an unrepresentative quarter, required her to produce the 2nd supporting document, which she did from the 3rd stack to her left. She had organized 5 stacks. She had anticipated 5 categories of objection and prepared documentation for each. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which Finch looked at his solicitor, and his solicitor looked at the documents, and the 2 magistrates looked at each other with the expression of men who have just watched a piece of work done very well. The agreement stands, said one of the magistrates. He was a heavy-set man named Colonel Birch, who had the manner of someone who had made many decisions in rooms not unlike this one. He said it simply, as a professional conclusion, without drama. Finch looked at Harriet for a moment with an expression that was not precisely respect, but was the expression of a man who has encountered something more solid than he had planned to walk through. He nodded, once, to Calder, and the meeting concluded. Harriet gathered her documents, organized them into their stacks, and tied each stack with the ribbon she had brought for the purpose. She was on the third stack when she became aware that the Duke had stepped forward from the position he had held for the length of the meeting, back, against the wall, entirely still, entirely present, and was now beside her. She looked up. He took the fourth stack of documents from the table and held them while she finished tying the third. He said nothing. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her with the undecorated directness that was, she had come to understand, his actual face. Not the social instrument, not the formal apparatus, but the man who stood in corridors for 40 minutes listening through closed doors. She took the fourth stack back from him and put it with the others. Lord Ashworth was standing near the door. He waited until the room had largely cleared, then crossed to where Calder stood with the Duke. He did not look at Harriet. He looked at the Duke. "She is not," he said, in a measured tone that was doing very careful work on his own certainty, "what I expected to find managing an estate inquiry." "No," the Duke said. "I imagine not." Ashworth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to the Duke, and with the particular difficulty of a man who has built his certainty carefully and is finding one section of it unreliable, "She is extraordinary." "Yes," the Duke said. "She is." He said it without flourish, without emphasis, in the tone he used when stating a fact that had been established and did not require defense. He said it in a room where Harriet could hear him, and in a room where Ashworth could hear him, and in a room where 2 magistrates and a land agent were within distance to hear him, and he said it as though he intended all of those things simultaneously. Harriet was looking at the 5th stack of documents. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. She straightened her spine and continued. Then she heard the Duke say her name, Miss Fulwell, and when she turned, he was standing before her, and the room still had people in it, and he said, "Will you allow me to discuss a permanent arrangement?" It was not quite a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It existed in the small space between the two, where precise people sometimes live. "Yes," she said, "I will." He proposed formally that evening. Practical, considered, structured like the agreements he understood. He named the terms, the estate, the position, the mutual responsibilities. He sat across from her at the library desk, which was where she had come to feel most clearly herself in the 14 days at Ravenscar, and he presented the proposal with the same care he had given the accounts documents. She listened completely. She thought about it for a silence that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, which was longer than silence usually lasted in professional meetings, and which the Duke held without filling. "I will accept," she said, "on the condition that I continue to maintain independent administration of the estate accounts." That was already the proposal, he said. "I wanted it said plainly," she said. "So did I," he said. The private proposal came 3 days before she was to return to London to conclude her arrangements with the Clarendon household. He found her in the morning room, which was where she had taken to writing her final summary of the estate's organizational requirements, and he stood in the doorway with the morning light behind him and said, "I want to say this separately from the formal terms." She set down her pen. "Not because it is convenient," he said, "or because the estate requires it, or because my solicitor prepared the language, but because you sat in a library at 9:30 and told me you do all the calculations, and I have not stopped thinking about it since. Because you played my mother's composition without knowing it was hers, and played it exactly as she intended. Because you straightened my cravat in a room where you owed me nothing, and told me it had been crooked for 40 minutes, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being told things I need to know by the person in the room most likely to have noticed them." He was very still, he was always very still. But this was a different quality of stillness, not containment, but the stillness of a building that has settled into its correct foundation after a long time of having been slightly, structurally wrong. Harriet looked at him for a measured moment. She thought about her father's house, and the solicitor who had been honest with her, and the morning she had folded the letter from the north and put it in the drawer, and decided she was not going to become less than she was. She thought about 6 years of accounts and creditor negotiations, and unlocked contract clauses, and annotated ledgers, and the music room at the far west end of the house, where she had played a composition she did not know, and felt, for the length of it, entirely seen. "I would like that too," she said. "Very much." They were married in the spring. The service was small, held at the estate chapel in Suffolk, with the oaks beginning to leaf, and the drive's left gravel edge already repaired, because Harriet had added it to the spring works list in February. Calder attended. Mrs. Bowman stood at the chapel door with Agnes beside her, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting, without permitting herself to say so, for the house to be inhabited by the right people. A small group of county families attended, including one of the magistrates from the wool meeting, who shook Harriet's hand with the straightforward warmth of someone paying a debt that was long overdue. Lord Ashworth attended. He spoke to Harriet briefly in the chapel yard, in the precise manner of a man who had revised a conclusion and was doing the work of saying so without having had practice at it. "I was mistaken," he said. "In my initial assessment," he said it to her, specifically, not to the Duke, not to Calder, but to her. "I wanted you to know that I am aware of it." "Thank you," Harriet said. "That is handsomely said." She meant it. She had not required his recalibration, but she found she was glad of it, which was a different thing. Lady Cecily did not attend. By March she had become engaged to a baron in Wiltshire, whose estate had considerably better shooting, and whose mother approved of the match with the unreserved warmth she had never quite managed for Ravenscar. Harriet wished her well with the sincere generosity of a woman who understood that the machinery had produced the correct result by its own methods. The estate accounts for the first year of the marriage showed a recovered margin of £420 annually, which was the figure that reached Calder's desk in January, and which he filed in the folder he had labeled simply Ravenscar. Administration, new, with the satisfaction of a man who had always known what the right arrangement looked like and had waited patiently for it to present itself. Harriet's annotated renegotiation of the wool agreement was adopted, in adapted form, by 3 neighboring estates within 18 months, because Colonel Birch had told 2 of his acquaintances about it, and they had told their land agents, who had asked Calder for the relevant precedent. She had not asked to have it shared. She had simply done the work correctly, and correct work has a way of traveling. The tenant farm agreements were all renegotiated and properly recorded by autumn. The secondary accounts were brought to order by the end of the first summer. The music room at the far west end of the house was reopened, cleaned, and used regularly, which meant that Mrs. Bowman occasionally paused outside the door at 9:30, with the expression of someone who had been waiting 12 years for that room to sound like itself again. Their son William arrived in the second year, a solid, observant child who had his father's stillness and, from approximately the age of 11 months, his mother's habit of looking at things twice before accepting them at face value. He was the kind of child who went straight to the piano when he could walk, not to press the keys dramatically, but to press them one at a time, and listen to how each note resolved. He also went directly to the estate office when he could run, and had to be retrieved on 3 occasions from under the desk where the current ledgers were kept, which was where his mother often worked, and which he seemed to have decided was the correct location for a person to be. 3 years after the wedding, the revised estate administration model, Harriet's annotated account structure, and tenant renegotiation methodology, was compiled into a written document by Calder and presented to the County Land Agent Association as a practical guide. Her name appeared on the title page as the author, which Calder had arranged without particular comment, because it was accurate, and he was a man who believed that accurate attribution was a basic professional courtesy. She had looked at the document when it arrived, run her finger along the line of her name, and felt something that she did not try to name because she had never practiced naming it. Simply the long-held certainty that she had always been capable of this, and the quiet resolution of a world that had, finally, looked. In the evenings, when the accounts were closed and William was asleep in his crib down the corridor, and the house had settled into the particular warmth that houses take on when they are properly inhabited, she worked at the library desk, and he read in the chair across from her, which was where he always sat, and the lamp between them made a circle of light that was sufficient for both. He was watching her. She could feel it, the way she could feel the draft from the east window she had never quite gotten the glazier to correct, and the way she could feel the slight unevenness in the third stair on the left. Familiar, constant, requiring no particular response but acknowledged. She looked up. He was watching her the way she had been told a man watches something he has decided, irrevocably and without condition, is exactly where it belongs. He did not say anything. He simply returned to his book, because the evening was theirs, and there was no requirement to fill it with anything other than what it already held. She picked up her pen and returned to her work. They were home. They had built it, the way all the best things are built, carefully, accurately, with full knowledge of every figure in the column and every load-bearing element in the structure, and not a single decorative addition they had not both agreed was worth the wait.